Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our forum on investments, the WSU Endowment, the WSU Foundation. My name is Phil Weiler. I'm Vice President for Marketing and Communications here at WSU, and I'm going to serve as our moderator today. I'm joined today by Mike Connell, who's our Vice President for Advancement and the Chief Executive Officer of the WSU Foundation, and also Leslie Brunelli, who is Executive Vice President for Finance and Administration. The purpose of our conversation today is to really talk about, first of all, what is the WSU Foundation? Also want to talk about what is an endowment? How many endowments do we have? How do they work? How are they funded? How are they managed? Some really important information. Also want to talk about, though, why do we have an endowment? How does it benefit students? How do our endowments benefit faculty members, our researchers? How does it support our service mission across the state of Washington and around the world? But before we begin, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge the fact that WSU's locations across the state are on the homelands of Native peoples, people who've lived in this region since time immemorial. We talk about an endowment as a responsibility to maintain something in perpetuity. I see that our obligation to the original caretakers of this land in a similar kind of way. We have an obligation to them. When Washington State College was first established in 1890, the institution was granted 90,000 acres of indigenous lands to help fund the institution. As I think many of us know, however, the disposition of those indigenous lands were often taken either through coercion, through acts of violence, and frequently in violation of established treaties. So as a result, Washington State University has an obligation, a debt of gratitude that we owe to these original and current caretakers of the land that we are currently using. We also have a responsibility to establish and maintain relationships and strong partnerships with these tribes and Native peoples. So with that, let me jump in, and I'm going to kick us off, Mike, with I think a good basic beginning question. You are the Chief Executive Officer of the WSU Foundation. What is the foundation? What's its relationship to the university? How does it function? That kind of thing, and we can go in from there.
Sure. Thanks, Phil. Good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation today. What is the foundation? In 1979, the foundation was organized primarily for the purpose of stimulating voluntary private support to WSU. The university had done proactive fundraising before that, but not in a truly organized manner. And Dr. Terrell and a number of volunteers concluded there would be a benefit to setting up a separate 501c3 supporting organization to benefit WSU. There were a couple of motivations for that beyond stimulating private support, one of which I think is pretty germane today. At that time, the university as a state agency was limited in terms of how it could invest assets that had been contributed for endowment purposes. At that time, I think the university could only invest in bonds. And so having the subsequent endowment assets become foundation assets allows us to invest in a diversified portfolio. Depending on your familiarity with investments, modern portfolio theory would suggest a diversified portfolio will both increase returns and decrease risk. So one of the many reasons the foundation was put in place. We do have a governing board, 25 people. Most of them are WSU graduates or very close to WSU. They help us achieve our mission of maximizing private support and effectively stewarding the assets that we've been entrusted to. There's a variety of committees involved. The relationship between WSU and the WSU Foundation is governed by a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, and I think it provides a good guiding principle for the two organizations to work together. But fundamentally, the foundation is here to help WSU.
And Mike, you used the term 501c3. I think some folks are familiar with what that means, but for those of us who aren't, can you explain what that is and how a 501c3 organization functions?
Let me say barely, Phil. So there's a good chance for my disclaimers. I'm not an attorney. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a CFP or CFA. I'm a development professional with advancement responsibilities. In this case, separate nonprofit, independent, but it is specifically for the sole and exclusive benefit of WSU.
Yeah. So independent of the
Yeah.
university, but exists to benefit the university. That makes sense. Okay, great. So you mentioned the board of directors. How are those folks selected? Are they compensated? What does that look like?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. And I won't go all the way back to 1979, though we will see one of the founding members this weekend. Today's board is, again, 24, 25 people, identified either by my team on here in the foundation. University leadership might say, hey, I think Steve or Sally would be a great member of the board. But generally speaking, they're very passionate about WSU. They are volunteers. And interestingly enough, as part of recruiting them to the board, we asked them to become regular, generous donors to WSU with a minimum annual gift of $25,000. So significant financial support of WSU. They are among WSU's best friends and are really helpful, both in terms of their philanthropic support, but also the insight and guidance they provide to me and my team, the development professionals across the university, Kirk, deans, chancellors, etc.
Well, they certainly have skin in the game if they're having to contribute for the benefit of being able to be a volunteer. So that's great. So we talked about the foundation. The foundation's job, I understand, is to manage the money that has been donated to the university. And I've heard the term endowment. Can you explain what is an endowment? Do we have just one? Do we have more than one endowment? What's their purpose and how do they typically work?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I'll go to the donor level to start the journey. If you think, many of us have been in the Leidy building. Phil and June Leidy. Phil was a WSU graduate. He decided he and June wanted to set up a scholarship. Phil had come to WSU from California and paid out-of-state tuition. And he thought, I'd love to help kids who are out of state kind of reduce their expenses. So the purpose of their first endowed scholarship, was to cover the marginal difference between in-state and out-of-state. So kids from California end up paying basically the same as kids from Washington. So Phil and June, sitting down with development professionals at WSU, end up creating a gift use agreement. And I think we have a very basic slide on gift use agreements, but if you want to drop that in there. But the idea is the university and the foundation and the donors agree that we will receive the funds, we will invest them, to your point earlier, in perpetuity. And then here's how the proceeds of the endowment will be distributed and expended each year. And so in the case of the Leidies, a scholarship helping kids from out of state cover the cost of attendance here at Washington State. So you've got a here's how an endowment works slide. And if we want to jump to the GUA slide, either one's fine. But when I think of an endowment, I tend to think of those conversations we've had with donors over the years in setting up endowments. Now there's just under 3,000 different endowment accounts like Phil and June's, and they cover a wide spectrum of utilization here at WSU. About half of them are scholarships, but we've got endowed professorships, we've got endowed deanships, we have endowment funds that provide discretionary funding for chancellors. It is a pretty broad cross-section of ways that individuals are trying to help WSU through their philanthropy. And so they see the benefit of perpetual support. Nobody really likes the word perpetual, but that's the idea. It's steady support. Many of us at WSU this year dealing with some budget cuts, and each of us are trying to figure out the most efficient way to utilize our funds. Endowment distributions went up this year. And so the idea of an endowment ends up being 3,000 different endowments. And that's how we end up with $722 million in the combined endowment. One of the reasons it's referred to as the combined endowment is there were endowed funds before the foundation was in place. So you've got some university assets in there. The university is not allowed to give money away, even to the foundation, practically speaking. And so there's some endowment assets that are university assets, but the vast, vast majority are foundation assets. That may have answered some of your questions, Phil.
Yeah, and I'm looking at this slide here and it talks about distribution.
Yeah.
So my understanding is, let's say I donate $100 to the university, you would invest that, you wouldn't spend that $100, you would only spend what earnings came off of that $100. I see the 4%. Can you talk about what does that mean? If I donate my $100, how much money is being able to be used, put into use each year.
Thank you. And I'll go back to Phil and June and just use round numbers, though I'm grateful for your $100. Let's assume Phil and June established their endowment with $100,000. So the 4%, generally speaking, we make a distribution each quarter of 1%. So over the course of a year, you end up with 4%. So if Phil and June had started with 100,000, as the process plays out, there would be a $4,000 scholarship for a student in a given year. There's a little more math to it than that, but for very general purposes, 4% comes out. That the investment committee obviously is trying to have a return that's greater than that, so that we can retain and increase the buying power of that fund.
Yeah. Okay. And so again, just make sure I'm clear. The at least in theory, we should never be spending that original $100,000 gift. It's just the interest that, or the return that is generated from that amount of money.
In theory, sure, but occasionally folks will they'll make the deposit and the market drops a little bit early on. But
Yeah.
if you look at it over the long haul, more than 100,000 is in there, and more than 4,000 should be coming out of there, as long as you're willing to be patient if you got up to a rough start. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. I appreciate the. And on the slide, you can see for fiscal year, that's the period that ended on June 30th, about $27.3 million was distributed from the endowment. So I think in virtually any context, $27 million is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I think we can take the slide down. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about private gifts that in this case, a pair of WSU fans donated. Are there other forms of gifts that the university receives or that the foundation manages beyond just private gifts that individuals make available?
No, I appreciate the question. In the fundraising space, we track private support to WSU. So that would be a philanthropic gift from an individual or household. It can also be from a corporation or a foundation. We track private grants to the WSU, which are primarily the result of faculty doing meaningful research. But in terms of endowment monies, as a very general statement, the endowment is private support where the donor said, endow these funds. And most times that would be from individuals. There are corporations that have set up some endowments, some private foundations, but the vast majority of the money would have come from individuals.
And then you were talking about those gift use agreements. Those are essentially like a contract with that says we commit to investing this money in a certain way to make sure that we're getting an appropriate return on investment.
And we're agreeing as to how the funds will be spent, that those proceeds, that distribution, that 4% each year, there's concurrence between the University Foundation and the donor. It's, again, Phil and June, out-of-state kids, help cover the marginal difference between out-of-state and in-state tuition. Yep.
Well, I guess that brings up an interesting question for me. So we couldn't, for example, go to Phil and June's account and say, gosh, the university is experiencing a financial downturn. We're going to take some of that money that they donated to support operations. That sounds like that's not acceptable.
Correct. And I appreciate you asking. This came up a fair amount 5 or 10 years ago. And I know Leslie wasn't here then, but as universities and others were kind of trying to find capital and deal with financial challenges, there's in the news, oh, this place has a $500 million endowment or a $5 billion endowment. Why aren't they just using those dollars? And you hit it right on the head, Phil. That's why they're not utilizing these dollars. But we have 3,000 contracts with individuals to say, here's what we agree. We're setting these funds aside on a permanent basis, and we will utilize the benefits of those dollars in this manner. So if we set up, we decide we want to establish a college of law, let's just carve out $100 million off the top of the endowment, go spend it that way. We've violated 3,000 contracts in very general terms, but it's just, it's not consistent with the agreements we have with these donors.
Great. Well, this is maybe a good segue to ask a question of you, Leslie. Speaking of the money that we use to operate the institution, one source of money that we use to operate are tuition dollars. So can you talk a little bit about when a student writes a check for tuition, how is that money used? Where does it go? Does it go to the foundation?
Okay, thank you, Phil, and good afternoon, everybody. So our tuition and our state appropriations are our two largest sources of our budget outside of federal grant dollars, for instance. Those two operate our core funds budget, which all of us on this screen have core funds budget, whether you're in an academic unit or in a service support unit or even the foundation or marketing and communications. When students write their checks for tuition, those are deposited in the university's account. They are invested, but they are not invested by the university's foundation. In fact, there's a lot of state law that prohibits the commingling of those funds. Our dollars are invested primarily by the state treasurer's office. So we have very different perspectives on dollars as far as us versus the foundation. The university's intent is to manage liquidity and have dollars available for operating so that we can pay our faculty and staff and we can pay our vendors on time and appropriately. So our perspective is liquidity, the access to these dollars when we need them. It's not the long-term time horizon that the foundation has. And because of that, we are more risk averse. So our dollars are invested in a way that protects the capital.
Great, thank you. Speaking of investments, so Mike, going back to the foundation, you have an investment committee. What is their role? What policies govern their decisions? How does that group function?
Sure. Thanks, Phil. The investment committee is again made up of volunteers. So these are individuals we've recruited to manage this, bucket of capital, $722 million. And so they come from various places and stages. Again, most of them are graduates of WSU. Many of them are donors to WSU. Many of them have established their own endowment accounts. But we identified them and recruited them to say, will you help us? And fundamentally, will you manage this money on behalf of the WSU Foundation for the benefit of WSU's faculty, staff, and students and our many programs? And so I think I mentioned earlier, there's 11 members of the committee. Earlier, I know I referenced there's some university assets that are part of their responsibility. And so per the agreement between the university and the foundation, in addition to our investment policy statement and the charter for the committee, there are two individuals I think that specifically have responsibilities because of the university assets. One is a regent. So there's always one regent on the investment committee, and then one regent appointee or designee. And so that's a second one. The other 9, I think you'd call just more the pure volunteer space. So that's the investment committee. And I mentioned there's an investment committee charter. There is an investment policy statement. And then broadly, and again, not an attorney, not a CPA, but there are laws for the governance of how you manage institutional funds. I think the overlay today, the acronym is UPMIFA. Leslie can help me here, but I'm going to go Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. And so compliance with UPMIFA and the idea of upholding your fiduciary responsibilities would be the general governance of their work. Leslie, what would you add to that?
Not necessarily anything about UPMIFA. I mean, the goal of UPMIFA is that we don't erode the corpus of the endowment, so what the donor originally gave. And the intent there is that with the distribution plus inflation, we're still able to maintain what the corpus of that is over time, because the purpose of the endowment really is intergenerational equity. It's to ensure that the institution is performing in future years, 10, 15, 20, and beyond into the future. So it preserves the institution as we know it. I did want to mention, because we've talked a couple of times about university assets that are within the foundation. It is a relatively small number, but there are endowments that were made to the university prior to the establishment of the foundation, prior to 1979, that did not transition over to the foundation. But those proceeds, while they belong to the university and not the foundation, they are managed by the foundation. There's also a handful of smaller things that happen periodically that are great news stories for us, but we allow the foundation to manage those because their return is typically higher than what we would receive from a more conservative approach to investing. And those are dollars that are related to capital projects. If you're familiar with the Pullman campus, there's quite a bit of activity right now that is donor related. The first of those is a facility that's being constructed for the Boylan College of Engineering and Architecture, the Schweitzer Engineering Building. That's an $80 million project with half of the dollars coming from the state, but half of the dollars coming through philanthropy. And as we have received those philanthropic dollars for that capital project, they are being invested with the endowment so that they can be returned to support the actual construction of that facility that's now underway. There's also two projects that are 100% donor funded for athletics. One of those is the Taylor Sports Complex, which is what we will call the old bubble that is no longer there, that will be the indoor practice facility for football, but will also serve some of our other sports, including track and field. That one was donated by many different donors, most notably the Taylor family, but those dollars were invested by the foundation and now are being drawn down as that project, frankly, nears completion in the next 30 to 60 days. And then finally, the Champion Center, which is in what we'll call the old physical education building in the old racquetball courts that are no longer there. We have turned that into the space for our student athletes to have their tutoring, their mental health counseling, their career counseling, nutritional counseling will be in that space, and that will open at the end of this calendar year going into the next calendar year. But those were philanthropically donated funds with the foundation drawn back in to support the projects.
Thank you. And Leslie, you used a term corpus. I think again, I'm not an attorney or an accountant either, but I think I know what it means. So let me take a shot at the definition and tell me how I'm wrong. But when seen my example of the $100 that Phil Weiler donates, that's the corpus, that $100. And the idea is that we need to protect that $100, and whatever gets spent is the interest or the return on that investment. That
is absolutely correct. Thank you for making it clearer.
All right, I passed one test. That's good. We were talking a second ago about different ways that funds are invested. Mike, can you talk about, what are those different, I guess, what would you call them, investment instruments or places that you might put money? Again, the idea is that, I think to use Leslie's term, we want intergenerational wealth. We want this money to be there in perpetuity and to benefit students for generations to come. What are the tools that the investment committee uses to try and make sure they make good on that mission?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. We've hired an outside advisor to help us with this, Mercer. And so we have an advisor. And one of the things that they help us with is asset allocation. If you say, okay, to some degree, what's your risk tolerance? What's your target in terms of investment return? How is it you'd invest these funds to achieve those objectives while minimizing the expenses you pay? And I think we have an asset allocation slide. So if you want to drop that one on the screen, I won't go into great detail, but I think it helps the audience understand that there are a variety of places we put these funds. And so again, the largest chunk is in U.S. equities, but there are a variety of other asset classes. And so some of these generate income, so that helps us. Other times when you're trying to have funds for distribution, you'll do some rebalancing, sell some assets, get back to this target asset allocation. So there's a couple of different ways to generate the cash that's going to come out to benefit the student, for the Leidy Scholarship. But this asset allocation is something that the investment committee spends time on. Mercer advises us on. And then Mercer, if we say, okay, how is it we want to participate in U.S. equity in a very general sense, the best way to do that, to be exposed to the entire U.S. equity market or an important segment of it, would be in index funds. It's inexpensive, and you're not necessarily picking stock. You're saying we believe in the U.S. economy. And so huge allocation to U.S. equities. But again, they would suggest us, here are three choices for index funds for U.S. And as you go around the pie chart there, they will bring suggested fund managers in the various asset classes to help us maximize the impact on Washington State University with the appropriate and acceptable amount of risk while having the most reasonable fees. And so that's the role Mercer plays, the investment committee, and ultimately picking the managers that help us fill each of these pieces of the pie. And I think you'd probably take the slide down. Thank you.
So Mike, you used a term that I have some familiarity with just because I'm saving for retirement, the idea of mutual funds or index funds. Can you talk a little bit more about those? I mean, my understanding is, as you said, we're not picking specific companies, we're not picking specific stocks.
Right.
An index fund is something different. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, really, and if you, I think to use a very general example, that the large cap domestic space is often referred to as the S&P 500. It's the most common and most familiar for folks. It's not a perfect example for the endowment because the index fund we use for that is more broad. But if you said, instead of buying a share or multiple shares of each of those 500 companies, there are fund managers that say, okay, we will create a composite that matches the S&P 500, and you only are buying into one thing. And so that's an easy way to have full exposure to, in this case, U.S. large cap domestic. Again, our exposure in the U.S. is a little broader, but it's a very simple, efficient, inexpensive way to invest in U.S. equity markets.
Great. Well, speaking about investing in specific companies, I know that we've seen across the country, there have been calls for universities to divest some of their funds from companies that might do business in Israel, might be invested in fossil fuels. I'm just curious, how easy would that be if you wanted to say we were going to divest from a particular company if much of our holdings are in those index funds, if we're not able to identify the specific companies that are being invested in?
Yeah, Phil, and if I recall, sometime between October 7th and today, I think 3 or 4 months ago, we even had a specific request regarding divesting from Boeing and or no longer accepting gifts from Boeing. So I'm going to answer your question, then I'm going to build on it a little bit. With utilizing the index funds, it's not practical to say I want to purchase the S&P 499. The idea that I want to do everything except Boeing. That fund, I'm not sure exists. It would be more expensive, and you're intentionally removing yourself from participating in the broader equity bucket that you are more broadly trying to match. And we don't. The WSU Investment Committee does not do any stock picking. And I want to be clear, there are some universities that do this. Those that have really big endowments will have an entire investment team on campus. And they're going to say, well, I see an opportunity here with this stock. For some reason, they believe it's undervalued. Let's purchase X number of shares of that. They'll see it bounce back. They'll sell it, make money. We don't do it that way. There are no public corporations where we purchase individual stocks within the investment committee space. And so it's not something that we, WSU Foundation, the investment committee, could or would do the way we currently manage these funds. And relative to the relationship with Boeing, I know, Phil, and I welcome your comments here, but the relationship WSU has with Boeing is long and rich and deep. I think from a engagement with students standpoint, I think last school year, 87 students received scholarships that were funded by Boeing. And so that's 87 students who are specifically benefiting from Boeing, but they also have a fantastic mentorship program. I think they may be the #1 employer of WSU graduates in the history of the university. They also probably have the largest internship program. And I know you and Kirk worked on a response to students that just basically said, at this point, we're not interested in monitoring or severing our relationship with Boeing. So my answer was both on the divest from Boeing, a specific company, but also the relationship with Boeing. And I appreciate the response that you and Phil crafted and provided to the student. And I know other students out there may not see the breadth and depth of our relationship with Boeing. This wasn't in the response, I believe, that you and Kirk put together, but I believe Boeing is the largest donor to WSU in history in terms of cash support to WSU. If it's not, it's top 5. And so in addition to everything else I mentioned, they have been incredibly generous to WSU.
Yeah, I think that's my understanding as well. We have a 55-year relationship with Boeing, and over that period of time, they have contributed more than $30 million, which makes them the most generous corporate partner that I think we have. So back to the question of not being able to identify particular companies that we're invested in. Do we have a sense, for example, of what percentage our holdings would be in, say, companies that are involved with fossil fuels. Is
Sure.
there a way to figure that out?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. And I asked Mercer to do this analysis for us last week. I got the update this morning. When folks talk about investing in fossil fuels and then how you invest endowed dollars, I want to break it into two classes. Earlier, we talked about direct investment. So there is no direct investment in public corporations. We don't buy Boeing, or, well, in this case, Chevron, let's say. And so there's no direct investment in public corporations. There is indirect, as I talked about earlier, through the index funds. Relative to private equity, there is some direct investment in private equity funds that are investing in energy. And so the Mercer team's response was, Mike, we can talk about energy, but we don't have the ability to specifically give you a dollar value or percentage that's fossil fuels or those that do work extracting fossil fuels in North Dakota or whatever it may be. So that the broader energy sector is currently on the private side, just about 5%. On the public corporation side, it's about 1.6. So if you just said 6.6, between 6 and 7% of the endowment is invested in energy. Some of that's going to be green energy, some of that's going to be fossil fuels. But as of this morning, well, the calculation is based on June 30 valuations, but that's the information I got today.
Okay, so somewhere around 7%, 6 or
Between
7.
6 and 7 in energy, just to be clear. Yeah.
Okay, great. Leslie, you talked about sort of a longer time horizon that the foundation has versus your time horizon, which is you need liquidity, you need to pay the bills when the bills come in. I'm curious, do we have any kind of timed investments where we're committed to saying we're going to let this money be in this investment for a certain period of time? And if so, what happens if you wanted to change that timed investment and pull money out of that?
Yeah, the intent for the university's working capital is liquidity. So our dollars are invested through the state treasurer's office, through Western Asset Management in short periods. In fact, some of the state law requires that our periods be less than 270 days. So we're very quickly turning things over in terms of the working capital. And the working capital of the university is very cyclical. I mean, if you think about it, you look at our budget or our financial statement, we're a $1.3 billion entity annually. So that means in the course of one fiscal year, approximately $1.3 billion of dollars are coming in and going out in different periods. A lot of that is concentrated around the academic term. So from the period late August, early September through commencement in May is the really heavy period of that. But our dollars come in a very erratic manner. They follow when the students pay tuition. So dollars come in August and dollars go out throughout the year. Then dollars come in again in the month of January and go out the rest of the year. One thing that's really interesting about the university's working capital is we are a very large research institution, and we do approximately $375 million in research activity across one fiscal year. Most of that is done in arrears. And what I mean by that is our faculty secure research grants, and they go out and do that, and they're either paid or they have grad assistants or other personnel, and they buy goods and services or equipment. Well, what happens is they spend those dollars, the university clears those either through payroll or through accounts payable. And then we go back on the back end and bill the granting agency for those dollars. So we're always a little bit behind in terms of those dollars moving in and out. And that's one of the reasons that we so very carefully monitor the working capital of the institution, because we are always a little bit behind in terms of our grant activity. And then we're following, of course, the peaks and valleys of the student tuition payment. On the other side, we receive state appropriations from the state of Washington, and that we know what that number is every year. And we're fortunate enough that we have access to 1/12 of that every month. So approximately once a month, the controller's office goes out and draws 1/12 of our state appropriation back into the university. So that helps smooth out the cash flow somewhat.
And I know that these are not accurate percentages, but essentially about half of our operating dollars, the money we use to pay our bills, comes from the state, and the other half comes from tuition, right?
Not quite.
Okay. I knew it wasn't exactly 50%, but
it's not quite 50%. I mean, if you think of in terms of our total financial activity, the 1.3 billion. About half of that is the operating budget. About $660 million is the operating budget, which is what's keeping all of us going. About half of that is then tuition, and half of that is state
and that's what I was
so
referring
you're
to.
getting percentages of percentages there.
Yeah, that portion of the operating budget would be, because I think sometimes people think about, well, the university runs on tuition dollars, and the answer is yes, but the state also is a significant contributor in making sure that we are being able to operate.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. I want to turn, we did ask folks to submit questions before we started today, and we've got quite a few here, and I'd like to get through some of them if we can. And the first one is a question for Mike, and it's an interesting one, I think. It's from a WSU staff member, and this person asks, can a unit seek its own endowment? If we have a program we believe someone wants to invest in, what steps do we need to take to set up this endowment? And so I'm curious about that. How does that work if I run a program and I think, boy, this is really important and I think that the public would support it? How do I go about creating a fund where people could donate to that?
Yeah. Phil, I think the message to my colleague is, walk down the hall to the dean or chancellor, whoever leads your enterprise, your college or department. We entrust the kind of the vision and the future and the priorities of the campuses, colleges, units to their leadership. And so the idea of saying to the boss, hey, I think this is worthy of pursuit of endowment dollars, having the conversation with your boss, and then every campus, college, and unit, athletics, libraries, whatever, has a development team. And so they'll bring in your development officer and talk about who might be prospective donors that we might go talk to about supporting this sort of endowment fund. And so the short answer is, this is a great idea. Go talk to the boss, make sure it lines up with her goals, his goals for the campus, college, and unit, and then talk to the development team about who prospective donors might be out there to fund the endowment, to support the endowment. Hopefully that answered that one. If not, that staff member should call me directly. Yeah.
And I'm going to jump in and add something there. So, from the accounting lens, the university cannot restrict its dollars. Only a donor, somebody external to the university, can actually do that. So setting up a true endowment does take the external party. And so if you were to find additional donors who give for this purpose, then that can become endowment. And there's certain thresholds, of course, that have to be met for something to be endowed. There is the possibility of a quasi-endowment, which looks and smells sort of like endowment dollars, but it's not really carrying the weight of an external restriction on the funds. The university has a policy out in the policy manual about quasi-endowments that might be helpful there.
Yeah, I think it's great, Leslie. Thank you. And I think the key message there is your boss isn't going to transfer money to set up the endowment. There is some discretionary money for most of our unit leadership, but most of those are the color of money that could not be endowed. I appreciate Leslie's clarification.
Yeah, and I'll jump in one more time. State dollars and tuition dollars cannot be endowed.
Well, and I will jump in too, because I have been trained well that I cannot go out and freelance and solicit donations from people without working with the foundation first. Is that correct?
It helps if everything is coordinated. Yes, Phil.
Yeah.
We've got some very generous friends throughout the WSU universe, and I'd much rather we're on a coordinated, we have a coordinated approach to our current and prospective donors and friends. Yeah.
So I shouldn't go to a donor and ask for $100 when you may be preparing and ask for $100,000.
Correct.
Yeah.
That may jeopardize the success of our larger strategic approach. Yes.
Yes. Coordination is a good thing. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question that was submitted, it says, how do we ensure ethical investments? I think that's an interesting question. How does that work? How do we decide where money goes?
Yeah, I actually spent a minute today, Phil. I'd seen these questions in advance. I Googled ethical investing. And it's interesting the response was on Investopedia was the idea that the investor will make their investment decisions based on their ethics, their social, political, religious views. There is no singular social, political, or religious view for WSU, the WSU Foundation, our investment committee, our board, our regents. WSU's got what, I don't know, Leslie can tell me, 10,000 employees, 30,000 students. There is no singular view in terms of what is ethical. And so I don't think it's something we strive for in terms of how we invest money. The investment committee, I think, appropriately sees their charter as very specific. How is it we have the greatest impact on the students, faculty, and staff at Washington State University while accepting the appropriate risk and paying the least amount in fees as we can.
Thank you.
And can I add a little bit to
please.
that, please,
Yeah.
Phil? I'm sorry to keep jumping in.
No, please.
The university actually has a separate investment policy because of our funds that are invested. And I've looked to see what do we mention specifically regarding ethics. And it is there is a section on that, but it's really focused on those folks who are in decision-making roles, avoiding conflict of interest and avoiding partiality. So
Yeah.
there's nothing deeper than those two things, but conflict of interest is very specifically mentioned and outlined.
Okay, so no self-dealing.
Mm-mm.
Well,
Yeah.
and let me supplement Leslie's commentary, because our board members and our investment committee members also sign paperwork regarding conflicts of interest. I mean, it is really important that we don't have an investment committee member who's saying, buy my company. Yeah. So definitely everything above board, we're crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. Thank you, Leslie.
Great. So this next question, I think, is a little bit in the weeds, but this person clearly had some information, some understanding of this. So I want to ask it. This person asked about investments we have with an acronym they used, which was SSGA, which I'm assuming means I had to look it up myself. I think it means State Street Global Advisors. What is that organization? Do we have any involvement with State Street Global Advisors?
We do. And again, I had a chance to look at the questions beforehand, so I did double check this. We are in 2 SSGA funds. Their U.S. Total Market Index Fund, we've got about $159 million in there. And then they have a MSCI Emerging Markets Fund, and we've got about $13 million in there. So those are, to the best of my knowledge, our 2 positions with SSGA. I'm with you, Phil. It seems like a very informed question. That's what I found is the answer. If somebody on my team finds more, I'll happily respond to whomever has additional follow-up on that.
Sure. I had one more question from a student. You mentioned, Mike, Mercer is a firm that we work with to help make our investments. This person was wondering, what's Mercer's, the term they were using is their assessment of divestment. I guess what that is asking is, what is Mercer's opinion about the idea of maybe divesting based on certain sort of viewpoints of the world?
Yeah, I think so. Again, we hire Mercer, so they're our advisor. Our relationship with them is such that that's not a question we would ask or they would answer. We can ask, do your clients divest or do they not divest? But I don't think their role is to give us guidance as to whether we should divest, whether that's in the fossil fuel space or the Israel-Palestine space. That's not a role we seek for Mercer to play. And so to be frank, I don't believe the question's ever been asked, and I don't think it should be asked, if I understood the question properly.
Yeah, great. Well, we're getting to the end of our questions here. I'm curious, Leslie or Mike, anything that I didn't cover that you'd like to add? Any closing thoughts for us? Nope. Leslie says no. Mike, anything from you?
Well, I think we've kind of walked around a little bit the world of divestment, fossil fuels. I mentioned the exposure we have to that. This is a complex space, and there are a variety of perspectives and points of view on this. There are universities or foundations that have chosen to divest from fossil fuels. There are numerous universities and foundations that have chosen not to. The investment committee met last week, and in my conversations with them, they are grateful for the fact that we've not provided any sort of restrictions. It's allow us to do our work. Let us do the best we can to generate the most money for the students, faculty, and staff at WSU while accepting the appropriate amount of risk and minimizing the fees that we are paying for that. I have had a couple conversations with students, and I really appreciate the outreach. Sometimes they'll call Leslie and Leslie will send them to me, or they'll call Kirk and Kirk will send them to me. And Kirk, he was great. He said, Mike, if you're going to sit with students, I think it makes sense to involve the dean of students, Jenna Hyatt. So Jenna and I have had a couple conversations with students. And the conversation has been really rewarding and beneficial. Interestingly, one of the outcomes of our most recent conversation is the idea of, could we either establish or supplement a fund that is in support of those who are refugees? And so while we may have started the conversation around divestment around Israel or Palestine, I think the students concluded that that pathway may not be as practical as they would have thought, but can we find a way, we, the students of Washington State University, are the ones I was meeting with, to support refugees? And initially thinking specifically Palestinian refugees, there may be some restrictions on our ability to have a fund dedicated to Palestinian refugees. So when you broaden it to refugees, then we're in the process of doing the framework to set up, I think there may be a fund already in place. And so we're just making sure there's awareness. We're updating our website. It'll go live in about a week and a half. That refugee support fund will be on the homepage if folks want to support refugees. My point is, these conversations are welcome. My information is pretty easy to find on the web. I don't have a vote on the investment committee, but I am the CEO of the WSU Foundation, and I want to make sure I'm able to convey the areas of interest that our students, faculty, and staff are representing. At the same time, I want to be clear that when I have a conversation with 7 students, I don't interpret that as the majority of the WSU undergraduate population. When we have a conversation with faculty, they're not necessarily the entire voice of this universe. And so my takeaway relative to the endowment is I am really grateful. I mean, 2,910 funds. That means 2,900 times individuals have sat down and said, I want to support, I want to utilize WSU to help other people, whether that's a scholarship fund, whether it's research that's being done here. And I think WSU is a great vehicle to support others. And so my message relative to the endowment is gratitude. I am incredibly grateful for the generosity of these people. And then I'm also really grateful for our volunteers, that whether it be our board, whether it's the regents, whether it's our investment committee, for their willingness to help us do this work well.
Well, you kind of did a nice job of starting the last question I was going to ask, which is, we've talked, for 45 minutes now about the foundation, about investments, about the endowment. I'd like to really focus on like, why do we do all this stuff? Yeah. What is, if you could in a couple sentences, what is the purpose of the endowment? Why should we care about this? And you sort of alluded to it in your closing remarks there, but what would you say if someone asked, why do we have an endowment?
I think it's the opportunity for individuals I truly believe WSU is a vehicle here. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, or in this case, Phil and Judy, want to help other people. WSU is the vehicle. The endowment is the permanence of that support, so that I know that forevermore, but for a long time, I'm able to continue supporting other people. I believe in the case of Phil and June, they believe in WSU. They believe in higher ed. We want more kids to come to WSU and be able to afford it. And so we will take this widget that's an endowed fund and let it be the vehicle through Washington State University to support other people, so that we've got, in this case, a more educated society. Yeah. Leslie, what would you add relative to the endowment?
It's a critical source of revenue for the institution. I think, we've done a lot of talking over the last year about the financial health of the university and the financial sustainability of, frankly, higher ed in general, not just this university. But the reality is, while we rely on our students to pay tuition, we rely on the state to pay the bills, we are going to be looking for what is that other source of income. And, we talked about everybody has dealt with budget cuts along the way. Our expenses grow faster than our revenue ever can. So diversifying our revenue stream and having philanthropy be one of those pieces that fills in some of the gap source is critical. We see it in real time in terms of capital investment and these new facilities that are coming up on this campus. But it really is something that we need to expand to our operating budget so that we have a sustained source of income to support the university in the future.
Great. Well said. Any other last thoughts before we close for the afternoon?
That's it, Phil. And again, I'm happy to have conversations with students, faculty, staff, donors, especially when I talk to donors. But
All right. Well, Leslie, thank you for making yourself available. Mike, thank you for
Absolutely.
making yourself available. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate all of you who've joined us from all over the state. We don't often have opportunities to have these sort of in-depth conversations about issues that are really, really critical to the institution. And so I'm glad that you spent your time with us. So thank you. With that, everybody enjoy your day and go Cougs.
Go
Go
Cougs.
Cougs.